Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another episode of Moving Mud, the History of Iron Bombing podcast. This is episode 24, The Navy Goes Feet Dry, in which we're going to talk a bit more about the United States Navy's war in Vietnam. Before we do that, though, I'd like to make a quick digression to talk about the sources that I use in putting together this podcast. It's been a while since I started on episodes about Vietnam, and it's fair to say that it's a pretty well documented little piece of military history. Now, there's certainly no shortage of material to read on the subject, but I do want to take a step back and talk about what I read and why, and kind of how I treat that material in terms of including it in the podcast. And first, I want to remind my loyal listener base, well, how we got here. By which I mean that this podcast started out, and still remains, my own personal exploration of the last 70 or 80 years of air-to-ground combat, and specifically what changed and why, and where did that lead. I was motivated to explore this topic because of playing Digital Combat Simulator, especially as DCS expanded the time frame that it modeled, which allowed me to experience, to some extent, and understand the differences in aircraft design, tactics, techniques, and procedures in ways that I really didn't get from reading history books on the same topic. Now, the podcast has strayed pretty far from its original flight simulator roots, I would say, although I'm not sure the audience has necessarily. But the basic idea remains the same. I'm mostly interested in looking at the history of air-to-ground warfare, of iron bombing, through the lens of how what happened was shaped by prior events, and then how it shaped future development. So, with that as the basic setup, here's my brief take on what's often referred to as the historiography of Vietnam, particularly the air war in Vietnam. First of all, I think one of the most important things to note is that the vast majority of material about the Vietnam War, and particularly the air war, was written after the fact, and written in full possession of the knowledge of how things turned out, effectively, and this matters. It was also almost all written with a particular message or point in mind that the author really wanted to make. That message or point of view is often revealed in the prologue or the foreword of the work in question. The message often, frankly, I think has something to do with explaining why the United States Air Forces did not win the air war. Because they didn't, and this is obviously a fact that took some getting used to. Usually, these explanations are focused on explaining why the fault was of people, named Johnson and McNamara and maybe Westmoreland. Now, to be fair, honestly, because those guys had already pretty much taken the fall for the failure by the time the books were written. Now, sometimes the perspective that the authors take also influences the biases of authors in terms of what they believe should have been done, both prior to and during the conflict, in terms of shaping the designs of the aircraft, the organization of the force, and also its tactics. Now, the author's perspectives can also be shaped by their own backgrounds, by their service history, including which service they served in, Air Force, Navy, or Marines, and also as well as their history after Vietnam, particularly whether they remained on active duty. All of which influences my perception of the assertions that authors make, particularly some authors. So if I don't appear to include or agree with some of the sources that are out there that you may have read, it may not be because I haven't read them. It may just be that I don't find them as helpful as I do some of the ones that I do choose to depend on. Now, in particular, one of the issues that I'm trying to get help with from sources, and finding it a bit of a challenge, is to develop a specific timeline of events. Because it's important to remember that as far as looking at aircraft design, which is one of the things I want to do, our actual exploration of the state of aircraft design and design technology, we really hadn't gotten any farther than the early 1960s before we started talking about the Vietnam War. I mean, the last aircraft we really talked about was the F-4, and it entered service in 1961. So there's a whole set of aircraft that are going to end up fighting in Vietnam that arrived in the middle of the conflict. And these aircraft were designed after the U.S. nuclear deterrence strategy was changed. And they were completed and brought into service after combat had begun in Vietnam. And these facts are important because it changes the way their designs were completed. It changes the way they were used. But it also complicates the use of various sources because, you see, right now I'm really trying to understand the very start of major combat operations from, say, the spring of 1965 to the spring of 1966. But the issue is that most histories of Vietnam tend to lump the whole of the Rolling Thunder campaigns, which lasted from mid-1965 to late 1968. They tend to dump all of that in the same drawer, essentially. And it means that they often mix up anecdotes from different parts of the timeline, and they often compare the state of tactical development in 1965 to the end of 1968, which is when Rolling Thunder ended, and then they compare that again to the start of 1971 or 1972 when Linebacker started. But it's a little bit hard to establish exactly what was known when and how equipment and tactics evolved over the course of those first 3 years, which they did. And I'll also be honest, and another difficulty I have in trying to get a good read on air-to-ground combat from the published histories of Vietnam is that I find it's a little odd, but I find that most accounts in discussing the threat that the Air Forces faced, they tend to demote the amount of space that tends to get dedicated to each kind of threat, is kind of inversely proportional to how dangerous the threat actually was. And by that I mean most accounts spend most of their time talking about air-to-air combat, often with lengthy first-person descriptions of dogfights. But the fact of the matter is that MiGs accounted for only a very, very small fraction of the United States aircraft lost over Vietnam. Now, after talking about MiGs, these accounts generally devote significant space to the SAM threat, often dissecting it in some detail. But again, SAMs actually accounted for a small proportion of aircraft losses, around a quarter. Most of the aircraft losses, over 2/3, in fact, were the result of anti-aircraft artillery, which is often mentioned, but only in passing, and sometimes with some interesting stats about how many guns the North Vietnamese had and what caliber, etc., but with relatively little explanation of how those defenses were organized and how the Navy and the Air Force defended against them. And the one aspect of the North Vietnamese integrated air defense system that really gets no press at all is arguably, I think, the most important part of what made it so effective. And that was that it was integrated. And it was that it was integrated, the weapons, the shooters, were integrated with an array of sensors and intelligence gathering mechanisms, which meant that the North Vietnamese routinely had very precise and timely information about American intentions, which meant that they could prepare. And it also meant that they could concentrate and prioritize resources, which I think is a vastly underestimated factor in why the North Vietnamese integrated air defense system was so difficult to defeat. In fact, I'd argue that on the few occasions that the United States was able to successfully mask its intentions, like Operation Bolo, and when they achieved real tactical and operational surprise, these were also the occasions in which they handed the Vietnamese People's Air Force its most telling tactical defeats. Again, this matters because it reveals that the authors that wrote these accounts, I think it reveals some of the biases of those authors. And it's not that I'm saying that they're wrong, I'm just saying that they're not interested in the same thing I am, which is specifically trying to figure out how the art and science of air-to-ground and surface-to-air combat evolved during and after Vietnam. All of which is to say that that's the way that I what I'm looking for when I read the sources. So if my analysis of those sources sounds a bit off to you, a little bit different than what you're used to, maybe that's why. So with that being said, let's pick up the narrative about the Navy and the early days of Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, last time we talked about the aircraft that the Navy had coming into the fight. Today, let's talk a little bit more about, my favorite topic, doctrine. Now, this is actually more difficult with the Navy than with the Air Force, because Navy doctrine wasn't really written down in the way that Air Force doctrine was. And one also gets the feeling that in the Navy, a lot more was left to the discretion of the individual carriers and their air wings and air wing commanders, or even the squadrons and squadron commanders, a lot more than was true in the Air Force. Still, from what I've pieced together, I think it's fair to say, and there's a few things we can say, about how the Navy was prepared, or not, for the job that it was going to be asked to do in North Vietnam. Now, first of all, it's certain that the Navy was not as focused on nuclear delivery as the Air Force. There's no way it could have been more focused on nuclear delivery than the United States Air Force. This was for the very good reason that the Navy had decided that its arm of the nuclear deterrence triad would be provided by submarines carrying intercontinental ballistic missiles. I would say it's also true that the Navy had an advantage over the Air Force in that the war that they were going to be asked to wage was quite similar to the one that they had fought last time in Korea, more similar in ways than the Air Force's war was. The Navy also did have command officers with combat experience, but they had not really revisited their Korean War experience much through training or planning because for the decade in between, the Navy had gotten kind of away from that. But they still, I think, collectively suffered from some misconceptions about what would work and what would not, at least partly because a lot of the institutional memory had either been lost or decayed in the decades since the Korean War had ended. For instance, the Navy, I think, dramatically underestimated the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery. With the advent of jet attack aircraft, it had basically become an article of faith that fast jets were too fast for gun crews to track and hit, and therefore the Navy placed a lot of faith in the use and effectiveness of low-altitude, high-speed ingress tactics. They did this, in part, because, at least in the early days, they were actually concerned about the SAM threat in the ways that the Air Force doesn't seem to have been, but they also assumed that the right way to counter that threat was to avoid it by ingressing low and fast under the minimum engagement altitude for the SAMs. So, thus, having overestimated their capacity to evade SAMs, they then at least kind of initially underestimated the need, I think, to confront the SAMs in their native environment, which is the electronic environment, which, to be fair, was a similar issue that the Air Force had, at least Air Force tactical aviation had. Now, because the United States Air Force acknowledged that their strategic bombers were going to have to penetrate SAM-denied airspace, the Air Force had put a significant amount of effort into passive defense measures in the electronic spectrum, which is a fancy way of saying jammers. But as we've also talked about, the Air Force jamming equipment was large and heavy, and by and large designed to be operated by specialists who did nothing else. The Navy, on the other hand, realizing that their bombing force was going to consist of single-seat attack aircraft whose pilots were, after all, fighter pilots, the Navy took a lot more interest in active defense measures. And when they did implement passive defenses, they knew that they would have to be operated by those self-same fighter pilots who frankly had a lot of stuff to do. So specifically what I'm saying is that the Navy moved to upgrade the A4 from the C to the E model, which was its primary light attack aircraft, and they upgraded it to be able to carry the very first anti-radiation missile, the AGM-45 Shrike. And they also upgraded the A4 with the first, if I'm right, the first rudimentary radar warning system. Now, these systems equipped the A4E model, which began appearing in the fleet in 1964, and which was technically the numerically most prevalent variant in the spring of 1965 when Rolling Thunder kicked off, but if you look at the composition of the air wings that flew, the C model is still quite prevalent. Most of the air wings are a mix between Cs and Es. Still, it meant that the United States Navy enjoyed an organic capacity to deal with the SAM threat inside their own attack squadrons, which the United States Air Force did not have and did not develop. Still, it's also fairly obvious that frontline squadrons hadn't really done a lot of thinking about how to use this capacity, even though it existed, at least not in the very early days of Rolling Thunder. The first SAM kill of a Navy jet was in August of 1965. The response to that event was to organize a large hunter-killer mission the following day, with 2 squadrons of conventionally armed A-4s going out to look for SAMs. Now, the experience was similar to what happened to the United States Air Force when they tried the same thing. The tactics played right into the hands of the North Vietnamese. The strike was chewed up by AAA and ended up attacking dummy SAM sites instead of the real thing. But to be fair, it was not a mistake that was really repeated, and we'll talk about that in due course. Okay, that kind of gives a sense of how the Navy viewed the threat that it was facing and maybe some of the misconceptions that they had. I think it's also fair to say, though, that the Navy had some misconceptions about their own capabilities as well. Specifically, the Navy overestimated the capability of air power to destroy or disable or even disrupt the economy or the economic infrastructure of a whole country. It was a lesson that probably could have been learned from the Korean experience, but was not. From the remove of 60 years, it really does seem to me that the bomber mafia mentality still kind of pervaded the whole air warfare community. For reference, this is the idea that air warfare was the best weapon to basically end a war by bringing a country to its knees. It had, in fact, never worked, except when atomic bombs had been used. But it was this misconception that underlay the whole U.S. approach to the air campaign in the North. Honestly, it was what the air campaign was supposed to do. It was supposed to convince North Vietnam that it was too expensive to continue to engage in fomenting unrest in the South. And it never really did that. And the problem is basically, I guess, if you want to talk about the analogy of using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, which is what the U.S. kind of thought it was doing, the problem is that a big sledgehammer isn't very useful for cracking even small walnuts when they're in a bucket of big muddy water. In other words, if you can't locate your targets, and if there are a lot of them spread out in a very opaque background, you'll spend a lot of effort, but much of it is going to miss the target, and it will turn out that since the target is so diffuse, you can't really take out all of the targets. And in this case, your target just really isn't amenable to being bludgeoned into submission, regardless of how big a sledgehammer you bring to the fight. I think one of the very important things about Vietnam was, in fact, the rise of precision guidance and precision targeting, specifically because finally people began to realize that this was the truth of the matter and that strategic bombing was really never going to fulfill the promise that the bomber mafia adherents thought it would back in the 1930s. But you know what? That's definitely a topic for another day. For now, suffice it to say that the Navy entered Rolling Thunder believing that massive firepower was the key to intimidating the North Vietnamese into heeding U.S. warnings not to involve themselves in the conflict in South Vietnam. So, let's take a look at how the Navy brought that firepower to bear. One of the big differences between the Air Force and the Navy was the way in which pilots were sent into combat. Whereas Air Force pilots were assigned to squadrons permanently stationed in Thailand and then rotated out when they had finished a tour consisted of 100 qualifying missions, Navy pilots were assigned to squadrons before the squadrons deployed to the theater aboard their carrier. Pilots served their entire tour as part of the squadron, meaning that they stayed with the squadron until the carrier returned from its cruise, unless, of course, they were killed, captured, or wounded. Now, pilots could be posted in as replacement for losses, but by and large, the squadron trained together and fought together for the entire deployment as a group. I believe this had some subtle but really quite significant impacts. It was certainly one of the conclusions of the Vietnam experience that the practice of letting personnel rotate in and out of units in combat was not beneficial to unit cohesion, either on the ground or in the air. I think it's fair to say that Navy pilots had much stronger bonds with the squadron and the shipmates than their Air Force counterparts did with their squadron mates. I think it's also fair to say that the squadron and even the air group leadership had a greater influence on operations, tactics, and performance than was true in the Air Force. This is just a sense I have, but when you read the histories, you'll find that the squadron commanders and the carrier air group commanders are almost always mentioned, and they are almost always at the forefront of the action in those mentions. But the same is not true for the Air Force. With some very notable exceptions, the squadron and wing commanders are often not even mentioned by name in the various first-person accounts, and there are, in fact, many references to the fact that they basically didn't fly at the point of the spear, and so often they are mentioned with, well, let's just say that the comments are often not all that complimentary. And the wing and squadron commanders in the Air Force also rotated in and out regularly, just like everyone else. So whereas many COs in the Navy seem to have made lasting impressions on their units and the pilots that flew in them, including influencing their tactics, I don't think the same can be said for the Air Force. Now, in terms of command arrangements, all carriers conducting the air war in Vietnam were part of the 7th Fleet, and in particular part of Task Force 77. Carriers would be rotated to Task Force 77 as part of looks like about a 6 to 9 month tour. Once they arrived on station, they were usually based in Subic Bay in the Philippines. From Subic, they would sail to the Gulf of Tonkin for their line periods, which generally lasted about a month. They would then rotate back to Subic for a month to resupply and refit. When they were on station, they operated from one of two locations, most often from Yankee Station, which was off the coast of North Vietnam. Now, occasionally they would also be stationed off the coast of South Vietnam at a station that, with some tongue-in-cheekness, was labeled Dixie Station. Dixie Station was only actually used for about the first year and a half of Rolling Thunder, though. Carriers and air groups that had not previously deployed to Vietnam were typically sent there for their first line period to get broken in, doing mostly close air support and route recce's in the relatively permissive air defense environment of South Vietnam, before moving to the more dangerous skies of North Vietnam. In the early days of Rolling Thunder, in the first few months, there were typically 3 carriers, I think, operating from Yankee Station at one time. These would have been a mix of the smaller Essex-class carriers and larger Forrestal and Kitty Hawk-class carriers. In the first year of Rolling Thunder, there were typically 4 Essex-class carriers and 1 supercarrier on deployment. In fact, in the fall of 1965, though, there were 8 carriers in total deployed to the Vietnam theater, including the new carriers Independence and Kitty Hawk, as well as the very first nuclear supercarrier, the USS Enterprise. Now, each of these carriers embarked a single carrier air wing known as a CVW. The air wings were similar, but there were variations between them, particularly between the classes of carriers, since the supercarriers could carry different aircraft than the Essexes could. Typically, a CVW consisted of 2 light attack squadrons, which basically in 1965 meant A4Cs or A4Es. They would carry 1 medium attack squadron, which was typically A1s, and a heavy attack squadron, which was A3 Sky Warriors. And then they'd also carry two fighter squadrons, which were either F8s or F4s, and then they'd have other detachments to handle tasks like reconnaissance, refueling, early warning, and electronic warfare, and they'd all also include a helicopter detachment. There were some variations between the carriers, and the composition did evolve as time went on. Now, even though the newer carriers were much larger, they generally seemed to carry air wings of about the same size. The main difference being that the Essex carriers could not operate the F4 or the A6. The first supercarrier on station, USS Ranger, carried basically a standard complement, including a squadron of A1s. The A6 arrived in theater aboard the Independence in May of 1965, where they replaced the A-1s as the medium attack aircraft in that carrier's carrier air wing. Now, once on the line, the carriers operated every day if the weather permitted. In fact, because they had the freedom to operate fairly close to the North Vietnamese coast, they usually managed to conduct 2 missions a day. Pilots did not fly every day, since there were usually more pilots than planes in a squadron, but it was not unusual for pilots to fly more than 50 missions in a single month-long line period. So it was not inconceivable for Navy pilots to fly more than 200 missions, sometimes significantly more, in a single deployment. In fact, it's a pretty normal situation. But after a month-long line period, carriers would rotate out of the line for a month to restock and reset, and during these periods, pilots would obviously not be flying combat missions. But they would have time to consider the missions that they had flown, which may not have always been a good thing, but it may also have been a blessing in some ways, because it did allow squadrons to discuss tactics, techniques, and procedures as a group and to implement new ideas during their line period the next time. This is an effect that does not get talked about a lot, but I do think it must have been important, especially when you compare it to the experience of the Air Force. One certainly gets the feeling from reading the histories that Navy flyers felt more bonded to their whole squadron than the United States Air Force pilots, who seemed to have found a few comrades in arms, but who on the whole didn't really seem to identify with their squadron all that much, except for specialized groups like the Wild Weasels. So the nature and pace of operations for a naval aviator in Vietnam was quite different, I think, than for an Air Force pilot, and it's worth remembering this when you read both the histories and the personal accounts. The Air Force pilots tended to fly much longer missions and carried much larger bomb loads, but they flew less frequently than the Navy pilots did. The Navy pilots flew for very intense periods, followed by rest periods taken as a whole squadron or wing. The Air Force pilots flew less intensively, but with only short and widely spaced breaks for leave, often only enjoyed by themselves and 1 or 2 other buddies. The Navy pilots lived aboard ship, with all of the limitations that implied, including, I believe, no approved access to alcohol, and often no air conditioning, at least on the older ships. The Air Force pilots lived in large bases with many modern conveniences, including a well-stocked O-Club bar. In short, the main thing the Navy and the Air Force pilots had in common were their targets and their enemy. But not surprisingly, while these features of their service were similar, their approaches to them were markedly different. But you know what? I think that's probably a good place to leave it for the day. In the next installment of Moving Mud, we'll take a look at how the Navy's approach to the mission and to their enemy changed over the course of the war, and how it differed from their colleagues in the United States Air Force. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.